Conditional clauses in Greek. These are often left to the end of textbooks, but they're not actually that bad in New Testament Greek. There are, however, quite significant differences between New Testament Greek and Greek more broadly, particularly if you're going to read the Septuagint, anything classical, or patristics. So in this screencast, I'll talk you through both sets, along with a few examples. First of all, what is a conditional? A conditional clause is one containing if in English. They have two parts. The first part is the part with the if in it. And this is called the protasis, which comes from two Greek words, unsurprisingly. You've got pro, the prefix having to do with before, and the verb tasso being drawn up. The second part is called the apodosis, which again comes from two Greek words, apot didomi, the bit that's given afterwards. So this is one place where you'll see some more technical language in protasis and apodosis. In New Testament Greek, there are only three main kinds that you really need to think about. The language may get quite muddy. You may see language such as open and closed, real, unreal, possible, impossible, improbable. What it boils down to is this three sets of categories. And you'll have various combinations of things that can be allowed in the protasis and the apodosis. For a basic conditional, you simply need the Greek word for if, a, and an indicative verb. The apodosis can then contain any mood. It's most likely to be an indicative or an imperative. So an example might be, if it's raining, put a coat on, imperative, or if it's raining, I will put a coat on, indicative. The indefinite ones use that same word for if, but add the indefinite marker particle on, and that gives you aon. Once you've got on, you need a subjunctive. And again, in the apodosis, you can have any mood. Now, the fact that they're indefinite means they're referring, this is where the more hypothetical type stuff comes in. They're referring to something that is less true, less vivid, and you will find that these are often going to be translated with a future. Contrary to fact ones are the final category, and this is where you actually have to pay attention. You're used to seeing a plus indicative. You're used to on needing a subjunctive. However, the contrary to fact ones use a and an indicative in the protasis. And then on plus an indicative in the apodosis. So this is the one place where you will see on followed by an indicative and not a subjunctive. And you're going to want to translate this with the English word would. So, normal basic ones. If it's raining, I'm fed up. If it's raining, come in. Indefinite conditionals. If it were to rain, it would be a good idea to have an umbrella. Contrary to fact means it's impossible. It has happened and therefore can't be changed. This is largely going to deal with things to do with the past. If you had listened, you wouldn't have made that mistake. Those are your three basic kinds. The basic ones you've seen all over Greek. One of my favourite passages for indefinite ones, category 2, is 1 John chapter 1, where verse 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 all begin with an aeon, all trigger an indefinite conditional with a pormen, peripetormen, a pormen, homologormen, and a pormen again. This is a very rhetorically structured text, and you see in this first chapter how the indefinite conditional hangs everything together. There is another use of the conditional in this passage. That's hina and affair. Another use of the subjunctive in this passage, hina affair. That's a purpose clause. So you do need to pay attention because there may well be embedded uses of the subjunctive within bigger clauses. contrary to fact ones aren't terribly common. A good passage to read for these is Luke 17, verses 2 and following, because actually you get a whole range of conditional types here. First of all, you have a and an indicative. This is a basic one. Then you get an and a subjunctive. You've got an indefinite, followed by an and another subjunctive, and yet another one. And this is quite a nice example, because in verse 3 you get if he were to sin, aphes, forgive him, with the imperative. But in verse 4, if he were to sin, apheses, you will forgive him. So there you can see both the imperative and the indicative completing that conditional to give a kind of future or unreal general command. Finally, however, you do also get an a in verse 6, followed by an imperfect verb and an un. And that gives you your contrary to fact. There are discussions about whether this has to be imperfect in these ones, because you are necessarily referring to something past. That's the kind of bugbear that I've seen mostly in New Testament scholars. I've not seen concern classical Greek books as much, but that may be for two reasons. One is New Testament books often worry about the canon and the languages within the canon and have limited examples to draw their rules from. The other is that actually classical conditionals are so much more complicated in time spheres, it maybe gets swallowed up in that overall pattern. And if you see the charts I give later in this presentation, you'll be able to think through this a bit more about what exactly you think is going on. But Luke 17 gives you all three kinds of conditional in this one short passage, and including one of those slightly rare contrary to fact conditionals. Duff chapter 20, you see he leaves until the end of the book, gives you a short table that is quite a useful summary of the position. Basic, indefinite, contrary to fact. You've got a protasis and an apodosis, which use various combinations of the indicative, subjunctive, or other moods and tenses. One thing that he notes that you might also want to note is that we don't need to have the protasis and apodosis in that order. So they can be reversed. So if you see a conditional, you do need to think, is this looking forwards or backwards? You might also not use the word if in English. You could say, were I to go out in the rain, I would get wet. We haven't used the word if in English. You're not always going to want to use the word if in Greek, but you do need to be aware you're still expressing a conditional. In classical Greek, there are two main points to think about. First of all, there are many more subdivisions and classes. Most of these have got to do with varying things to be more nuanced by tense, and particularly using the optative to change the kind of probability and likelihood and definicy of all of these. But also, having structured exactly what you can and can't do, you can then mix and match different kinds of protasis and apodosis to say exactly whatever you want. So we learn the rules for conditionals, but then when we actually meet a text, we have to just think, okay, there's a word for if, what is this text trying to convey, and what is the balance of probability, likelihood and time in this, and how is that reflected in the grammar? There are two quite useful grammatical summaries that come at this from different angles. The first is the Cambridge Grammar of Classical Greek. This was published in 2019 and is a very useful book. It's quite big, 800 pages, and very dense, but it does offer a lot of thinking through these things by people who are linguistics experts and include people who are keen on thinking about the New Testament and its Greek too. So it is written by people who care about what we are trying to achieve. And what they do here is they take you through type of conditional and build in how that is reflected in different tenses. What they call neutral is what we would see as basic. The prospective is what we would see as indefinite. And the counterfactual is exactly that, contrary to fact. The big differences then come with the potential and its use of the optative, and I'll do that in a different pen. The big differences come with the potential and its use of the optative, and the habitual, and again, its use of the optative, to give different kinds of ways of talking about the world. If you look at Smith, which is a much older book, he presents things the other way round. He gives you time sphere, and then the kind of simple general, and that's be your habitual or unreal conditionals that you can do within those time spheres. This is a useful book that many New Testament Greek scholars still refer to. It marks things out, as you can see by number 2297. These kind of grammar things don't work by page number, they work by paragraph number. And this table is his summary table, but he does split up each of these sections into another small numbered paragraph. So there is a whole section in this book on conditionals. What he hasn't given you here, which the Cambridge book has given you, is English examples. So you may want to mix and match these two tables to give yourself a bit more of an understanding. We're not going to worry about the Homeric reference because that is one bit that you really aren't going to be thinking about. Just to confuse matters. Okay, here's a passage from Hebrews, a couple of passages from Hebrews, where conditionals don't do quite what you expect. First of all, in the first two I've given you, you get eam pair twice. That pair, which is textually suspicious in the first one, gives you more of a sense of indefiniteness anyway. And then you've got your subjunctives. The conditionals are, however, referring backwards in this case. So as I said, they don't have to be protasis followed by apodosis. Here you've got the apodosis followed by the protasis. And the final example, which is repeated, it's a quotation from Psalm, you've got e eleusontai, eis ten katapausen mu, standard translated as, never shall they enter into my rest, rather than if they shall enter into my rest. It's an unfulfilled, incomplete conditional where we don't have an apodosis. So you're going to get occasional times where the conditional just doesn't do what you're expecting it to, and this is one of them. Part of this is decontextualised references to the Septuagint, but part of this is actually this is an unfulfilled conditional, and we have to think about how to interpret that in context and what to do with it. The Septuagint in general does use much richer forms of conditional, so you also need to think, as soon as you do see something from the Septuagint, what you can do to make that make sense with your New Testament hat on. So in summary, conditionals have two parts, the protasis and the apodosis. You're going to use a in the indicative or an and the subjunctive on the whole, or you might find other moods useful, but most of them are going to have just a basic indicative subjunctive change. Exactly how they work is likely to be context contingent, because you can mix and match the different types. That contrary to fact example that I gave you from Luke is unusual, so I don't expect you're going to see a huge number of those, but it is worth logging for reference. I will also supply a separate document that works through a variety of conditionals from other sources, so you can see how they do work in more complex forms. But for New Testament purposes, those three categories of conditional, the basic, the indefinite, and the contrary to fact, are all you need to learn.